So this movie is pretty much just about King George III and how he's getting older and stuff, and he's exhibiting signs of being mad or going crazy. And they didn't know a lot about it back then, so his doctors tried to cure him and stuff, and it seems nothing's working, and he keeps having violent outbursts and then confusion, and just he's a mess. And the queen, who was in the right mind at the time, and the prime minister are trying to not allow his son, which is the Prince of Wales and also King George IV, to uprise the throne while he's in this state of madness. So the quote I chose was by King George III himself, and he said, "You'll have to speak up, I don't see very well." And although it seems like funny and everything at first, and it is when you're watching it, then it becomes quite literal what he's trying to say. He can't see nor can he hear very well because of everything that he's going through, not only mentally, but there are physical effects on him that are just terrible. And this is how the rest of the movie it really reflects. And it's like there's some funny parts and stuff, but overall it's just sad to see him going through such a state, no matter how much of a bad guy he was. So the movie begins about 3 decades into King George III's reign, which would be around 1788, and it spans to about 1789. And some pieces that I felt really kind of put the story together was the urine and the bondage chair. I know it sounds funny, but if you watch the movie, the urine is brought up so many times for them seeing, it's blue or it's yellow, it's going back to normal. And that's something that was like heavily analyzed throughout the entire movie. And the bondage chair was seen quite a few times. Every time he had some manic episode, you would see just these group of people pull him and strap him into the chair, and it's just like this continuous thing. So I think the bondage chair and the urine bucket were really important to the story. For me, finding the contextualization wasn't that hard, but it also kind of was because it was put in the movie and spotted through it, but not directly, as the main focus was King George III's illness. But this is basically what was going on in Britain at the time. It was called the Regency Crisis, and so initially when King George III went mad, it was expected that the Prince of Wales would become regent, dismiss Pitt, and call on Portland and Fox to form a ministry. And a regency bill was prepared, but it wasn't enacted because unexpectedly King George, he recovered on February 1789. And this is shown at the end of the movie, his recovery, and it's shown his madness and all that stuff, and it shows his son, the Prince of Wales, a few times throughout the story, seeing that he is kind of like the main antagonist, like the main guy that's like against him. He's the leader of the people against the king, and it's shown, but I feel like it wasn't well sort of portrayed because there were spotty parts where it would show it and then not show it and go back to seeing how the madness of him was and all that stuff. But this was the main thing that was going on at the time, I feel, like at the direct time that the movie was around. There were other things, but it was more like before or after the movie, and so I felt that this was the best thing to contextualize. So I had trouble with comparing it to something. So I just kind of went with progressive. And I believed that it could partially fit into this situation because there was a conflict between two groups. It wasn't racial or religion based or anything like that, but it was definitely two prominent groups versus one another the entire time. So the side that was opposed to King George III was led by the Tory Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, and also his son, George III's son, George IV, or he was also known as the Prince of Wales at the time. And then the side that was for George III staying in was the leader of the opposition, Charles James Fox, as well as the Queen and the people that helped George III in his medical stuff. So it was like a big conflict for the time. Was it unsafe to keep King George III as acting ruler? Was George IV, or also known as the Prince of Wales, underqualified for the job? Well, this was resolved in the end of the movie, and King George his reign continued until his death. I don't know if this directly relates to it, but I thought there was some similarity or slight comparison. So I also had trouble depicting if it was continuity or change that has happened since this event in history. And I think in a way there's been change, in England at least. And I think the royal family is rather stable and that mental stability is very important to them. But I feel like going outside of England to our own country, well, although we weren't really concerned with him at the time, I feel like it was a good example of what our country shouldn't be led by. And I think as a nation, we didn't put much thought behind voting for the person we did. And I feel like the person that we did vote for, we voted for him because of, what he believes in and all that stuff, and not for the person he is. And that's something that I think our country should have analyzed deeper into, because now we're stuck with two childish old white men to choose between for our own president. And I'm saying that because of the recent presidential debate that showed how, professional that they are, and it's hard to think that we could have this maybe crazy person just running our country. And I wouldn't call either of them a monarch or somebody who's mentally unstable, but I still do think that we should have learned and put more thought into the people we're voting for. But I digress because this isn't about our history, it's more about British history here. And so if we're just going off of that, then yes, I do believe there's change. So how does this event really affect the future? I'm not sure if it does, but I feel like if you're thinking about it in a way that, if King George III hadn't continued to be the king and the Prince of Wales, also his son, King George IV, would have taken over earlier or whenever, if things would have been much different, if change was insinuated in a different way through that, or if it would have just stayed the same and England would be the same as today. I can't tell you that, but I feel like it would have had a much different effect on people at the time, because King George III was a beloved king, no matter how much of a nasty monarch he was and, stuff like that. He was loved by the people of his country, mostly, even though somebody did try to shank him and kill him. But I feel like it would have had a much different impact on how the country was set, especially the rules, because it seemed as if George IV was more into initiating things and getting things done at the time.
Do you look at me, sir?
I do, sir.
I have you in my eye.
No, I have you in mine.
You're bold, sir. But by God, I'm bolder.
So not look at me, I'm not one of your... Thomas! You must behave, or endeavor to do so.
Must! Must! Whose must is this? Your must or my must? Get away from me, you scabby bumsucker. Lick at your lick fingers!
Clean your tongue, sir, clean your tongue.
I will not. I'll be a guest in the graveyard first.
Very well. If your majesty will not behave, you must be restrained.
When felons were induced to talk, they were shown first the instruments of their torture. The king is shown the instrument of his to induce him not to talk. I won't. I won't.
Bring him back. Bring him back.
Stop! Stop! What are you doing, sir? What are you doing? I'll have you lost, my food!
The king refuses food, he will be restrained. He claims to have no appetite, he will be restrained. If he swears and indulges in meaningless discourse, he will be restrained. If he throws off his bedclothes, tears away his bandages, scratches his sores, and if he does not strive every day and always towards his own recovery, then he must be restrained. I am the king of England! No, sir! You are the patient!
So after watching the movie and finishing my analysis, I think I would give it a 4 out of 5 stars. Because I think that the script was really well written and it was funny but also heart-wrenching some parts. But the only parts that I couldn't really grasp onto were certain parts where they were talking all these fancy words and political stuff that I just didn't seem to understand. Because I hadn't learned much about this part of history since it's after America separated from England, and it's not American history. It has to do with the United Kingdom and all that stuff. So I didn't know much about what they're talking about. But overall, it was a really great film. And it was helpful for me to do this analysis to actually learn that part of history and what was happening. And I think the comedy and seriousness kept me focused and not slumping in my chair or falling asleep. I don't really think that the film had any real weaknesses. I think that was a weakness on my part where I just wasn't able to comprehend what was going on. And for the time it was produced, and it was very well thought out and very well put together. and the scenes flowed really well, and I could understand what was going on most of the time, even when I looked away for like a little bit. And I think I'll always remember this movie. It's a really good take on dramatic comedy, and it was impressive. So I think people should watch it because it's not only like serious and all that stuff, it's funny, and I think that's something that people could really respect.